Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I hope you'll take advantage of my websites, donkpreston.com or bibleprophecy.com. And we are continuing our study of the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and 25. We are focused on Matthew 25, 1 to 13, and the parable of the coming of the Lord at the time of the wedding, the 5 wise, the 5 foolish virgins. Now, as I have made a point of sharing with you, the vast majority of commentators divide the Olivet Discourse, and this is certainly true of both the amillennial and the postmillennial schools of thought. They divide the Olivet Discourse into 2 subjects. Matthew 24, 4 to 34, 35, is supposed to be a description of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 and the events leading up to it. They acknowledge that the Lord came on the clouds of heaven with power, with great glory at that time. Now, keep that in mind, all right? But anyway, at verse 36, all the way through chapter 25, verse 46, we are told that Jesus changes the subject, ostensibly to address the second question that the apostles asked in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 2, where, when Jesus had predicted the destruction of the temple, the apostles asked, "Tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Well, we are told, the apostles were confused at this point. As John Calvin said, the apostles simply could not imagine the dissolution of that temple unless it were to occur at the end of time and the end of the material creation. But you see, that is a false assumption. As I prove in one of my newest books, Watching for the Parousia, were Jesus' apostles confused? It's on my website. Take advantage of it. But in our study of Matthew 25, 1 to 13, and the parable of the wedding, here's what I want you to see. If it can be proven, as I have been establishing for several weeks now in my videos focused on this parable, if it can be demonstrated that Jesus is drawing on the Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, that in the last days Yahweh would, quote, return, unquote, and remarry Israel, that would be at the time of the destruction, the death, the divorce of Judah, whom he had not divorced earlier, and could not divorce earlier, because Messiah had not come. But in the last days, Judah would receive her harvest, the harvest that the 10 northern tribes had received, which was national kingdom destruction. And out of that death, out of that dying, would arise the body of Christ, the new man of Ephesians chapter 2, Colossians 3, Colossians 4, and an array of other passages. Out of the death of the old creation would arise the new creation. This is the time of the marriage of the Lamb, in which God would, once again, create a brand new people constituted of the righteous remnant of the Old Covenant Israel, plus, this is critical, those of the nations who would be invited to come and to participate in the salvation flowing from Israel. Oh, this is so important. So, what I've been sharing with you, and of course, once again, to drive the point home, if we are able to demonstrate that Matthew 25 is about the remarriage of Israel, the fulfillment of God's covenant promises to Old Covenant Israel, then it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Olivet Discourse is not divided. It's not about two different subjects. It's not about two different comings. One of them, Matthew 24, 29 to 31, ostensibly occurring in AD 70, and the other, Matthew 25, supposedly at the end of the current Christian age. Folks, there are not two comings of the Lord in the Olivet Discourse. There is one single coming, one end of the age, one wedding. Well, last week on Thursday, I shared with you some initial thoughts about Isaiah 49. Now, let's keep in mind that Isaiah is written in the context of the book of Hosea, with which it is roughly parallel. In Hosea, Israel, the 10 northern tribes, committed spiritual adultery. She violated the marriage covenant. As a result, the Lord, according to Jeremiah, written years later, gave her a bill of divorcement and put her away. He divorced her. Isaiah picks up on that imagery, on that language, on those motifs. Just like Hosea 2:19 and following, the Lord promised that the time was coming in which he would regather. Now remember, when God divorced Israel, he departed from her and he scattered her. Hosea chapter 8 and verse 8, Israel is scattered among the nations. Isaiah 49 is absolutely awesome. I mean, it is such a marvelous, such a beautiful, such a beautiful chapter. Isaiah 49, 5 through 6 is the promise of the regathering of Israel. But not only Israel, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob. Well, who are the tribes of Jacob? They're all 12 tribes. In addition to raising up, restoring the 12 tribes, I will also make you a light to the nations. Israel restored, nations invited. Now, we continue, verse 8. And as I told you, I could spend weeks right here in Isaiah 49 because I just love it so much, and because it is incorporated so much in the New Testament eschatological narrative. Okay, speaking of that time of the redemption, the return, i.e., the remarriage of Israel, in an acceptable time, I have heard you. In the day of salvation, I have helped you. I will preserve you and give you as a covenant to my people. You see, the you here is Messiah. I will give you to be a covenant to my people, to restore the earth or the land, to cause them to inherit the desolate heritages, that you may say to the prisoners, go forth, to those who are in darkness, show yourself. Folks, that is nothing less than resurrection. The image of darkness is the image of death in Hebraic thought. So, here encapsulated in verse 8 and 9, even though the word remarriage, even though the word wedding is not used, the idea of the restoration of Israel is the promise of the remarriage not only of the 10 tribes, but of all of the tribes. Because it's who was Jacob? Jacob was Israel, the father of the 12 tribes, not just the father of 10. So we have the promise of the regathering. Well, when would that be? As I pointed out last Thursday, it's the acceptable time. It's the day of salvation. So the time for the remarriage of Israel, all 12 tribes, and the time for the subsequent and consequent gathering of the nations, inviting of the nations into Israel's promises, is the acceptable time, the day of salvation. Well, you know, we go over to 2 Corinthians, and I understand that I talked about this last week. That's okay. Paul preached the ministry of reconciliation. As I shared with you last Thursday, I won't go over that again. I just want to hammer home this fact. Now keep in mind, we're talking about the time of the marriage of Israel. Matthew 25 is the coming of the Lord for the wedding. If therefore we can determine the time of the fulfillment of Isaiah 49, we have determined the time for the second coming of Christ of Matthew 25. If Isaiah 49 is to be fulfilled in the first century, then that means the coming of the Lord of Matthew 25 was to be in the first century, which means the Olivet Discourse is not divided. So Paul, urging the Corinthians, be ye reconciled to God. See, Isaiah 49 is all about reconciliation. Go back and watch the video from last Thursday, okay? We then, as workers together with him, we also plead with you to receive the grace of God in vain. For, he says, in an acceptable time I have heard you. In the day of salvation I have helped you. Behold, now. That's Paul's now. Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. Okay, let me repeat this. If it is true that Isaiah 49 is about the restoration and remarriage of Israel, i.e. at the coming of the Lord, Hosea chapter 5 and 6, and if it's true that Matthew 25 is drawing on that imagery, language, and motif about the remarriage of Israel at the coming of the Lord, then if it is true that we can determine when Isaiah 49 was to be fulfilled, then we can determine the time of the coming of the Lord of Matthew 25. Paul said the time for the fulfillment of Isaiah 49 had arrived in the first century. Therefore, the time for the wedding of Matthew 25 at the second coming of Christ was to be in the first century. You see, it's so beautiful, so harmonious, and so undeniable. Listen, I develop all of this and a whole lot more, pardon me, and I discuss Isaiah 49 and its interconnectedness with Matthew 25 in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, the wedding of the King of Kings. Because you see, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is Matthew chapter 25, 1 and following. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, order the book, send me a note that says you all saw the offer on Facebook or YouTube, and I'll refund your shipping, saving you $5. Okay, hey, we've got more on Isaiah 49, and we will see that on the flip side. I'll see you there.